Yes, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And what is showing on the screen right now is just my first slide. And if you notice, the title isn't there, and I wonder why. So the title of my presentation this morning is Chinos Indios as Sexual Deviants, Sodomy as a Colonial Trope of Moral Panic in the early Spanish Philippines. Can I move on to my next slide? Should I? Yes. So let me read first the thesis. The male heteronormative standard of the Catholic Church throughout history foregrounds the persecution of the Chinos Indios, otherwise known as the sangleyes, which, among other pressures on Spain, are brought to bear on the Chinese migrants in the form of a discursive moral panic on their being guilty of pecado contra natura, or sin against nature, or otherwise known as the unmentionable sin, or pecado nefando, which of course talks about the practice of sodomy. So at the start of conquest, redefined Spanish masculinity along racialized and sexualized lines as conquerors and missionaries and the Catholic kings made the idolatrous Chinese scapegoats in the threat they posed as an ever-growing and a powerful commercial community in the precarious New Asian colony. So can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so before reading the outline of the paper, what I did basically was to make a textual research of all those documents, the relaciones, the letters, and the basis of this was Blair and Robertson's first 12 volumes, plus two other volumes much later, with the mention of the word sodomy, sodomite, pecado contra natura, etc. That would be, the interest of this paper. So I then counted the frequency because I just put it in a concordancing software, which is a linguistic software to look at frequency, to look at keywords and their collocations, or what, the most commonly partnered words either to the left or to the right of the keyword, in order for me to gain a better understanding of the phenomenon called sodomy, according to, of course, the Spaniards. I use a framework of moral panic, which is basically what will be in the next slide, but I will give a foreground or background on the Inquisition and the impact on confession, and I will briefly describe the Manila Chinese community from 1565 to 1665, or the first 100 years of the colony. And I looked at the Spanish records on Chinese sodomy, but we need to contextualize this in the context of other bigger pressures. Confession, the role of confession in the Synod of Manila of 1582, and then the discursive features, or the textual features of the writings on sodomy, and then the priestly anxieties in their role as gender-marked male celibates, which is an important factor in considering how they viewed the Chinese sodomites. And finally, of course, the unsuccessful plan of eradicating and expelling the Chinese Indios as a result of this moral discourse. So can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so as I was saying, I'm using this sociological framework called moral panic. Moral panics are perceived social problems that organize and contextualize these social norms that originate in nodes of institutionalized power and are frequently seen in times of marked social disruption, whereby mass hysteria arises out of a group of persons accused of deviating from established moral or ethical norms or poses a threat and therefore identified in the original conceptualization of the word by or the concept by Cohen in 1971 as folk devils. In other words, the Chinos Indios or the sangleyes as folk devils. Many moral panics in history have involved issues of sexuality and gender. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So these are the characteristics of moral panics as studied by Ben Yehuda and Good. So the first one is of concern that there is an awareness that a group or their behavior impacts society negatively. And the second feature is one of hostility, wherein there is a clear division that exists between insider and outsider forms. There is consensus, which is a widespread acceptance that the group in question poses as a threat or a menace to the larger society. And then the idea of disproportionality, whereby actions to control the threatening group are disproportionate to the threat on the ground or the actual reality on the ground. And finally, volatility, which enters in these cases of mass hysteria appear and disappear in a particular time frame. So let's go to the next slide, please. This is just foregrounding the pressures on Spain at the start of conquest. So the Reconquista, of course, after having successfully expelled the Jews and the Moors, the 14th, late 14th century, then made converts out of the Jews, those at least who were left behind, known as conversos, and also the Moors, who were known as the Moriscos. Of course, they were now nominally Catholic and nominally Christian, but it was always suspected that these conversos especially were still crypto Jews or practicing Judaism in their homes. And it was felt by the Spaniards or the Spanish authorities that the Moriscos were less of a threat. But recall that both Moriscos and, or rather the Jews and the Moors before the Reconquista made the Spanish economy rolling because they were the ones providing the trades, providing the commercial activity, were the most productive tradesmen. And so there was already a model or a framework in the mind once they would come to the Philippines and found the Chinese. At this particular time, there was a reconceptualization of Spanishness or the identity of the Spaniards because they really felt arrogant or boastful because they had expelled the Moors and the Jews. And so this idea of superiority would be based on limpieza de sangre, or the purity of blood, or literally the cleanliness of blood, which would then affect three social aspects. The idea of vir, or manhood, not the idea of homo, which is humanity in general, but the idea of man as man, or the Spanish man as man, so known as vir. And then also the idea of the purity of race, known as la raza, or the race. And then, of course, comes into the picture the only true faith. These were, after all, products of the Catholic kings, from beginning with Isabella and Ferdinand. And so, at the start of conquest, you then have a highly racialized and sexualized or gendered hierarchy, whereby the Spaniard was superior above all others. Now, concurrently, there were internal and external pressures. Among the internal pressures was, of course, the growing threat of Protestantism, and also alternative movements, which included the Illuminists, alumbrados, who entertained ideas of Erasmus, who were forward-looking, and that also meant that the founding of a new order, the Society of Jesus, by Ignatius of Loyola, who had escaped Spain and went to France, in Montmartre particularly, where he founded the Society of Jesus, because he was also under threat because he was considered an Illuminist. Now, for the external pressures, the larger political and state pressures outside was the rise of the English, which then, of course, became the arch rival of Spain at the age of conquest, and also the loss of the Dutch colonies, the Flandes, in the Spanish language at the time, which would then result a century and a half later into the wars of the Spanish succession. So I'm just giving this as a context whereby once the Spaniards would discover the Philippines and discovering the Chinese there as well, they had already a mental framework on how the sangleyes or the Chinos Indios would be viewed. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, this is a framework by Weezer, 2015, where he analyzes early modern Spanish notions of race, gender, and sex. Now, this is supposed to be taken in a three-dimensional frame, whereby you have in the first plane here, in the first axis, the idea of gender, where women basically are placed in the middle, and the other end is the effeminate, normally the Moor, yeah? Normally in the Spanish conceptualization, because they thought that the Moors were the purveyors of this sodomitical practice. And race. So race, of course, the superior one would be Spanish, and then the Moros would be the least, they would be the most inferior in their consideration. And then finally, when it comes to sex, of course, man is the only figure that matters, and the woman would be the other side. And so if you think about this intersection of three axes in Weezer's framework, then we can imagine how the worldview of the Spanish conqueror as well as the missionary would affect the way they would treat not only the Chinese, the sangleyes or the Chinos Indios, but also the Indios themselves. So can we move on to the next slide? What I have done again is to find out how many mentions of sodomia, sodomitica, all those kinds of words, pecado nefando, or and I came up with 146 in total, yeah, mentions of. Most of these are just incidental mentions. Most of these just are a sentence or perhaps just a paragraph. But of course, the most vocal and the most vociferous were the archbishops of Manila, or the priests in general, or the missionaries. In my table, I have towards the left the bishop and the governor only for time frames. Yeah, only for time frames, and not that they wrote those things on sodomy. But each of them did have something to say. So the numbers on religious writings and secular writings towards the middle right of my table just simply reflects letters, relaciones, reports, documents, all other things that mention in the particular time frame of both the bishops and the governors. Okay, so you will notice three things immediately here. In the beginning, you have spares mention. Yeah, at the time of the Adelantado, Legazpi would only see, would only note that there were several dozens of Chinese with wives in the port of Manila, and that they had heard that among the pirates of China, they'd be practicing sodomy. And then as we go on in time or proceed along time, then you have more and more mentions of sodomy. And notice that because the early mentions were always with piracy in mind, the institutional form of sodomy was basically lost in the Spanish mind. Whereas they saw sodomy practiced among the Chinese pirates, and then later on among the Chinese prisoners, and then those other institutions where the male heteronormative standard would be implemented, and so therefore this idea of being forced into particular social institutions where there were only men was really lost on these observations. Now, each time a bishop would write to condemn or at least in a censorious way anything on the Chinese Semitic practices, so to speak. The power play between, especially of Domingo de Salazar, the first Archbishop, the first Bishop of Manila, and uh, Francisco de Sande was so marked. So, beginning here, there was almost like a tit and tat volleying between the Archbishop of Manila, mostly the Dominican Domingo de Salazar, and then Francisco de Sande. Because once Domingo de Salazar would write to the king or would write to the Inquisition or would write to concerning a Chinese sodomy, Francisco de Sande would somehow feel like assaulted in the sense that his powers was being usurped by the religious authorities in the person of Domingo de Salazar, the first Archbishop. So the pattern here would normally then be tit and tat, yeah, because of the power play between the religious and the secular authorities. Of course, the founding of the Inquisition, there was never really a formal institution similar to that of New Spain or Mexico on the Inquisition in the Philippines, but it was carried out through a comisario who did not really have the full powers as he did. The comisario was a 5-6 person affair and mostly composed of Dominican priests. But it was recalled that in the Inquisition in the Philippines, uh, the Indios were children, minors, as well as the Chinese, and they were not supposed to be part. They were not supposed to be part of the denuncias or the denouncements and then the trials. But it was easy to confound sexual practice later as part of the sin during confession. So that the most number of cases regarding heretical examples, because it's easy to confound that sex or improprieties during sex. The most number of cases here would then be what they call solicitación, or the priestly solicitation during confession of sexual favors from both men and women. So this is just what we see in the records. In any event, notice again that as we proceed in time, there would be greater and greater mentions, both from the religious authorities as well as in the secular writings of Chinese sodomy. So, what in effect is what I call this trope of moral panic, which would then affect the way, because the Chinese were now growing in commercial and economic power, and all along the Philippine economy was really in a precarious state. And so it was easy to call on or to equate the Chinese as the moral deviants practicing sodomy. Can we move on to the next slide? This is a sample writing. Again, all my texts or data are discursive or textual, and there are many. And I only will give 2 examples and read from Domingo de Salazar's Handbook of Confessors, translated, of course, in 2014 by Paul Dumal of the University of Asia and Pacific. Because they, the Chinese, are shameless and given to sodomy, the governor should make sure that they do not have male Indians for servants, especially boys. Let them serve one another as they do in their land, and that they are also given much to idolatry and other vices. And these will catch on easily among the new Christians, meaning the Indios, if they live with them, regarding all of which the governor is obliged under pain of mortal sin and restitution for damages that may follow. So this is now under the bishop or the governor here is the more friendly Ronquillo Peñalosa, and also the other liberal bishops. Again, the power play between these bishops and secular authorities. Can we move on to the second sample? That's this is Francisco de Sande, who was really having a hard time with Domingo de Salazar. Almost all Chinese are pirates when occasion arises, so that none are faithful to their king. Moreover, a war could be waged against them because they prohibit people from entering their country. Besides, I do not know, nor have I heard of any wickedness that they do not practice, for they are idolaters, sodomites, robbers, pirates, both by land and sea. So immediately you have all these records of othering the Chinese. Can we move on to the next slide, please? One of my observations regarding all these documents is that the Jesuits were another kind of people who were ambiguous regarding their observations on sexist or sexist and genders in indigenous Philippine society, and this would be reflected on their priestly anxieties on the babaylanes, asogs, catalonans, the shamans who were mostly women, but also included effeminate transvestites. And nothing offended the Spanish clergy more than these shamans who were anathema and incomprehensible in the early modern world, where race and sex hierarchies based on faith were clearly ranked and ordered. And so therefore, they were seen as moral degenerates. They belonged to the lowest of humans. Now, the Jesuit ethnographers, I shall call them because they are so verbose, Pedro de Quirino and Ignacio Alsina, living in two different time frames, but both are Jesuits, were very keen in observing the babaylanes or the asogs or the catalonans. But while they describe them very intensively, yet they finally hold back on their observations regarding what their sexual roles and preferences were, because these are induced by the priest during confession. And one of these mute Indians who was dressed, who was bodily a man, but they took on women's roles, but was just a civilian person. I mean, like he was not, she wasn't a shaman, and so he, in this case, Ignacio Alcina, wanted to extract information out of this mute Indio, especially on his sexual experiences and his sexual preferences. But they hold back. They don't tell us anything more about what happens here. And my reading is these priests, the Jesuits in particular, were rather anxious of their own male gendered role of being celibates, perhaps because of their own sexualities as well, knowing fully well that what this meant in that particular time and day. And so that this withholding, revealing, and yet at the same time, finally not disclosing in the end, is something that we need to uncover more by way of research. But what I'm very happy at is simply the collection of all these texts on, because the greatest fear of the Spaniards were that the Chinese would pass on the idea of sodomy in the Indios, or the indigenous peoples of the Philippines, not knowing that they had their own particular practices on this as well. And so the final solution was, of course, just like they had successfully done in Spain, to expel and finally eradicate the Chinese. But of course, this never happened. In Wickerberg's view, for example, on his second stage of the Chinese colonization of Manila, you would have the growth of the mestizo Chinese, who then became actually more powerful and became the political elite, as well as, of course, the economic elite of the land that would continue until our day. So they had not seen that. And while the Spaniards thought that they could establish China as a colony of Spain, or at least convert those people, it was far too ambitious and it was too big for their pantalones or their breeches, so to speak. So that's basically my idea here. So thank you very much. And I think my 15 minutes is up.